at the University of Manchester. And I'll be talking about this work today, which is actually the work of my PhD student, Eric Mendez Guzman, who's actually also in the call. So it's work in progress. It's the result. This work is the result of the first year of his PhD. But fortunately, it's going to be published soon in the upcoming conference on the 13th language or the 13th language resource and evaluation conference, which will be in France in June. So yeah, so essentially maybe the term forced labor doesn't need any definition, but just to clarify what the working definition of forced labor that we're using in this work is. So essentially we're taking the definition set out by the International Labor Office, which is essentially that forced labor is all work or service which is exacted from any person under the threat of a penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. If we're following the typology set out by the International Labor Office or ILO, then essentially it's a subtype of modern slavery together with forced marriage. And underneath forced labor, we have 3 different categories or subtypes, namely the state-imposed forced labor, the forced labor exploitation, and forced sexual exploitation of adults and commercial sexual exploitation of children. So essentially, based on a study which was conducted in 2016 and published in 2017, it is kind of known that there are about 40 million people who are affected or victims of modern slavery, almost 25 million of which are affected or victims of forced labor, and the other 15 million are victims of forced marriage. And then if we look at kind of the categorization under forced labor, we have around 4 million which are affected by state-imposed forced labor. So basically, this is the type of forced labor which is coming from government or essentially, the state itself. And this is followed in terms of like volume, followed by forced sexual exploitation at 4.8 million people. And then the largest kind of proportion is 16 million. And this is like the forced labor exploitation from the private sector. So note that these numbers are like from many years ago, I would say, like from 2017, and there haven't been any kind of new numbers published more recently. But one could probably imagine that, you know, these numbers could have worsened over time since 5 or 6 years ago. Now, if we look more closely at the numbers or the figures on forced labor, if we look at it regionally, essentially, again, based on the same report, they say that that forced labor happens more often or most often in Asia and the Pacific, and the figures that they came up with is that 4 out of 1,000 of every 1,000 people are essentially suffering or affected by forced labor. This is followed by 3.6 people out of 1,000 people in Europe and Central Asia, followed by 2.8 people out of 1,000 people in Africa, 2.2 people out of 1,000 in the Arab states, and lastly, 1.3 people out of 1,000 in the Americas. Although in the report, they also said that the numbers are probably not fair because some of the, for example, the Arab states, they were not able to kind of collect enough data or information. So basically, you know, just take it with a pinch of salt that these numbers might not be exactly correct because of lack of data in from some of the countries. So obviously, this tells us that, you know, that forced labor is kind of prevalent in many developing settings, essentially. Now, you might be wondering, what am I doing talking about forced labor if I come from the Department of Computer Science? So this is where I would like to talk about the role of artificial intelligence or AI in trying to combat modern slavery generally. So there have been previous work our existing work, specifically looking at how we can use AI to combat modern slavery, examples of which include some work on network analysis and anomaly detection, specifically for identifying patterns in financial flows, and also to detect populations which are targeted for exploitation. And there's also another piece of work looking at the analysis of mobile phone data, particularly to predict the incidence of forced labor in Africa. It's not a very well-researched area yet, which is why we could only mention kind of a handful of examples. What we want to focus on, though, because we specialize in natural language processing and text mining, is particularly the role of natural language processing, or NLP, in trying to, again, to combat modern slavery, in our particular case, specifically forced labor. A lot of information on forced labor are hidden or kind of obscured in textual records. And so the challenge here is how to kind of bring out that information if we are dealing with unstructured data. So if a lot of people are talking about their experiences with forced labor, but maybe in the form of narratives or stories, then how do we transform that in a structured form which is more easily analyzable? So that is kind of the main question that we have. So when we say stories or narratives, so we can be dealing with many different types, and I will give specific examples later on. But for example, one common example is like the stories that we read probably on a regular basis from news articles. Like, for example, this one is from The Guardian in 2017, where I think around 20 people kind of shared their stories on modern slavery and forced labor. And of course, I think the situation was just kind of aggravated due to the COVID pandemic, because a lot of stories also emerged since 2020. And again, these stories are kind of embedded in these news articles. So talking a bit more about natural language processing, it's a very huge and a very broad area with a lot of kind of research topics that people like us are looking into. But in particular, we are interested in a task called text classification. So this is the task which is concerned with essentially analyzing a given document and trying to associate it with the most relevant category out of a set of predefined categories or classes, simply speaking. Now, when we talk about detecting indicators of forced labor, so what this means is that we have a list of indicators, which are essentially 11 categories or classes. And we took this from the ILO, the published ILO classification. And then we want to associate or to assign any number from these 11 classes to a given input document, where in this case, a document could be a news article or a case report, and so on. To just exemplify, there are kind of variations of text classification. The simpler case is you have one document on as your kind of input, and you have your predefined classes as well of interest. When we say multi-class classification problem, it means that you have multiple classes to identify against, and then you assign exactly one label or category to your document. So that's kind of a simple or a simpler problem, I should say. But a more kind of sophisticated version of that is where you have a document and a set of categories or classes. But then here, there's a possibility to assign more than one category or label to a document. So this is what we call in NLP a multi-class, multi-label classification problem. Because then in this case, any of the 11 classes could be relevant to the document, which is the input. Now, generally speaking, when we hear about AI systems, not a lot of people are, not everybody is a big fan of AI systems, and this is because of the trade-offs that come with AI systems. So what do we mean by that? I think there's a lot of hype. Everybody knows that kind of, especially nowadays with the resurgence of deep learning and neural networks. A lot of these AI systems have very kind of, impressive and superior performance in terms of accuracy. And again, this is thanks to the resurgence of neural networks. However, the problem with neural networks is that they kind of become black boxes. It becomes very difficult to understand exactly what is going on inside the black box. Why does it produce this impressive performance? Why does it produce outputs which seem to be correct? But then nobody, not even the developers of such systems, can explain how this black box actually works. So what I mean here by trade-offs and considerations is that, okay, on the one hand, maybe because of the state of the art in AI, we're getting superior performance, but on the other hand, the explainability and interpretability suffers because you get kind of, impressive results, impressive outputs, but then you cannot really explain to an end user how the machine arrived at those outputs and how the model actually works, or how the model actually came up with those automatic predictions. And this is why in computer science and in AI more specifically, we have an emerging research area called Explainable AI, or XAI for short, exactly because of the demand for AI systems to be able to explain their predictions. So this research area, XAI, is focused on developing methods which will allow users, whether developers or end users, to understand the results of these AI systems. Now, in natural language processing or in NLP, when we say explanations, in the context of this work that I am presenting right now, what we mean by that are what we call rationales. So rationales are essentially a subset of the input words taken from the original document or the original text, which are most relevant to the decision or the prediction made by the natural language processing model. For example, if this is the input document, then which is clearly talking about or describing the experience of a migrant worker, let's just say, we have two examples of rationales here. The first one is the piece of text highlighted in blue, which kind of indicates a specific type of a forced labor indicator, which is in this case, I think, abusive working condition. And the piece of text in green is another rationale, which is indicating the indicator of, I think this is intimidation. So essentially, in other words, these are kind of, you can look at it as highlighted snippets of text within the original document, which help explain why a machine or an AI system would judge this document as being about abusive working conditions and intimidation. There are different types of rationale. So in the NLP field, we want to make a distinction between different types of rationale. So generally speaking, rationales or language explanations are interpretable justifications of a model's prediction, like I exemplified in the previous slide. But when we say human rationales, specifically, these are types of rationales which are human provided. So these are rationales where we've asked humans or human labelers or coders to do the highlighting themselves to justify why a certain document belongs to a certain category. And then we also have what we call extractive rationales, which are essentially also rationales, but this time they are generated by the machine. So a subset of the words from the input text that form a coherent piece of text that can explain the machine's or the system's prediction. So before I get into details how we created a resource to support the automatic detection of these forced labor indicators, I want to summarize what we actually came up with. So what we have produced so far, to summarize, is a new corpus or a new data set of migrant worker stories, which have been annotated for two things. So the first is the labels or the classes themselves. In other words, a document has been codified to indicate which of the 11 forced labor indicators are relevant to that document. So those are the labels or the classes. But additionally, we also codified the rationale. So we ask human annotators to select the pieces of text within each document to justify why certain labels or classes hold. So we wanted to do this because part of Eric's PhD really, or the overarching aim, is to develop models which can learn not only the document's class or category, but also why a document belongs to certain categories. Oops, sorry. That's because the next bullet point I wanted to show is a URL or the link to a GitHub repository, which contains the data set itself and the code developed to analyze this data set, which you can find here. So to the best of our knowledge, this is the first resource consisting of documents annotated for indicators of forced labor. As I said earlier, this area is kind of underexplored. So the dataset is novel, not only in terms of having these two types of annotations, labels and rationales, but also for being focused on indicators of forced labor. And additionally, we have produced, or Eric has produced, results of some baseline models for multi-class, multi-label classification. As I mentioned earlier, the overarching aim really, because Eric is doing his PhD in computer science, so then the overarching aim is to evaluate the impact of incorporating human rationales during model training. So it's a very computer science oriented research question, right? Because here, Eric is trying to focus on the explainable AI aspect of the project. So essentially the question here is, if we incorporate human rationales in model training, how much better, or is it the same classification performance that we're going to obtain? But also, does it actually help in improving the explainability of models? So just to get into more detail, how did we construct this data set that I have been mentioning? So what we have at the moment in the data set are news articles, specifically almost 1,000, or to be exact, 989 English documents, which are news articles published between January 2019 and 2021. These news articles, they have been sourced from different platforms, namely IBM's Traffic Analysis Hub, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and ILO. So all of these platforms contain news articles. So what we've done is we've taken the URLs to those news articles and then scraped the text from those news articles, giving us, as I said, almost 1,000 news articles all in all. Part of because as I said, this is only Eric's first year results from his PhD. Part of the future work really is to enhance or to augment the data in the corpus later on with written narratives. So we're working with two NGOs, 58, which is UK based, and Contratados, who are exactly working in the space of forced labor, combating forced labor, and they have the capacity to collect kind of firsthand worker stories, because they are working directly with migrants. And then another type of document which will be incorporated later on are reports and law cases from the Human Trafficking Knowledge Portal. But for now, as I said, what we have are news articles only. I was mentioning earlier that we are using ILO's indicators of forced labor, which they have published, and I said that there are 11 categories or classes here, and here I just listed them down, and so that you can see kind of what types of categories we're talking about. So these are exactly the labels or classes that we want to assign to any given document, and any number of them can apply to a news article.
Riza, just to check on those indicators, does
Yeah.
does the ILO say that any one of them represents forced labor, or that there needs to be kind of like more than one in order for something to be defined as forced labor?
I think any one of them. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And in fact, that will be reflected in some numbers that some results we were able to obtain later on, where you will see most of the news articles were annotated with only one. So yeah. We used an annotation or a coding tool called LightTag. So essentially, it's a graphical user interface which allows us to upload the raw text, as you can see here on the right-hand side, to define the classes or categories of interest. So those 11 classes that I showed you in the previous slide are the same as what you see here. It also allows us to kind of attach some annotation or coding guidelines that annotators can refer to as they go through the task. So the task really here is about highlighting by drag and drop the part of text on the right-hand panel and choosing the correct class that applies. So essentially, it's kind of hitting two birds with one stone, because you highlight the rationale by saying, okay, this is the snippet of text which I think is kind of signifying or signaling a forced labor indicator. But while doing that, while highlighting the rationale, you also select the class or category which applies. I put a link here. So essentially, this just takes you to the LightTag platform. So it's a cloud-based or online platform where you can upload your documents. So at the moment, because we're using news articles, then we don't have any issues with kind of data sensitivity or privacy. So that's why we're using a cloud-based solution. So just to have a close look at a specific example. So this is just to illustrate a specific example. I think this is directly related to COVID, or this happened during COVID, actually, the lockdown. So you can have a news article like this, and as I will touch upon later on, obviously not all news articles would be relevant. Not all news articles would contain actual narratives or worker stories. But this is an example of one article which actually has a story, and the rationale here will be in this first paragraph will be the piece of text highlighted in light blue. And that is categorized as indicating deception, which is one of the 11 classes. And in the second paragraph, the sentence highlighted in green is the rationale for the category abusive working and living conditions. In our guidelines, I'm not going to go into detail now, but we do say that it doesn't have to be a full sentence. It can be just a phrase, for example, or a clause, or, so basically just choose any part of the input text which kind of indicates or signals the forced labor indicator. And as I said, we are interested in multi-class, multi-label codification. So any document can have any number of those 11 classes assigned to them if they are relevant. So what we did to ensure quality of annotations is, at the beginning, we took only 100 out of the 989 news articles and had two different annotators annotate them. We measured the inter-annotator agreement both at the label level, so essentially looking at the agreement between the two annotators in terms of how they assign the categories to the documents, but also at the rationale level, specifically looking at how much do the rationales that they choose overlap with each other. And once we are happy with the agreement scores that we are getting, which in this case we measured using F1 score, at the label level, we're getting 81%, at the rationale level, 73%. Then each of these annotators worked independently. So the first annotator annotating a further 600 articles, which doesn't overlap with the other 289 articles annotated by the second annotator. So that's why, all in all, we have 989 news articles annotated. So yeah, I mentioned this briefly earlier. So some results in terms of like, okay, now that we've annotated the news articles, and what did we find out at this point? So on average, each news article was assigned 1.2 labels only. So that means that many of the articles were actually assigned only one category. However, the one issue that we had in our data set, which I also alluded to earlier, is that more than half of them actually didn't contain or weren't tagged with any forced labor indicator. So why that happens is that in selecting those news articles during the data collection stage, we, as with many as we typically do, we had to rely on keywords, right? So keywords like forced labor and so on. But obviously, just because a news article mentions these keywords doesn't mean that they actually contain narratives. But what's important is that we're actually, we wanted to make sure that the news articles we're looking at actually contain worker stories and narratives. So that's why a majority of them actually didn't contain them. So only 43% were tagged with at least one indicator. In terms of frequency of the indicators of forced labor for those news articles which do contain them, if we plot those 11 classes or categories against the percentage of news articles which are associated with them, so among the 425 news articles exactly with at least one label, 27% of them are for abusive working and living conditions, and 17% associated with abuse of vulnerability. So that means that these are the two most prevalent forced labor indicators. So now the succeeding slides, or actually this slide only, will be mostly about the machine learning that we have performed to construct some baseline classifiers. So in NLP, what we usually do is we take whatever is in the state of the art, right? So in NLP, the state of the art is based on what we call transformer models. So these are neural and deep learning based models, which are exactly like black boxes, right? But they are known to have the best performance in the text classification class. So we just wanted to see what happens if we, that's why we call them baseline, because we just wanted to really experiment what happens if we feed the data set, which has been annotated, to these state-of-the-art models, and how will they perform. And just to know, this is not yet kind of, Eric's kind of novelty in his PhD. This is just kind of playing around with the state-of-the-art models and seeing what happens if we use the data set with these models. So we tried different variations of the state-of-the-art models. You can see the names here, and I put some references for anyone who's inclined to check. What we did is taking those 989 news articles, we did a 70%, 10%, 20% split, using the 70% to train the model, 10% to tune, the hyperparameters, and the other 20% to evaluate or to test the performance of the model, so that the model is not trained on anything that is later on used for testing. The results that we're getting are not ideal, I would say. One can even say they're almost random, because even the best one, in this case XLNet base, is only, if we use the F1 score as a metric, different variations of it, weighted, micro average, and macro average F1 score. Even the best model, XLNet, is getting only as high as 52%, or in terms of F1 score, micro average. So what this means really is that this is a difficult task, because as I mentioned earlier, we're already using some of the state-of-the-art models, and on other tasks like sentiment analysis, for example, of tweets or news articles and so on, these models are known to perform and to give F1 scores as high as 80% and so on, for example. So I think our task is quite difficult, also because of the fact that we are looking at it as a multi-label task, meaning a document can be assigned multiple labels at the same time. So F1 score, the metric we're using, is quite strict, where it penalizes every time a label which is expected to be associated to that document is not predicted by the model. So this is good though for Eric's work, because it means that because, as I said, this is just kind of playing around with the state-of-the-art models. It means that there's a lot of scope to investigate how we can kind of improve upon this performance, and that's exactly what I wanted to show as part of our future work. So for Eric's future work, yeah.
Just to, for those of us who aren't computer scientists anymore, just to understand what you've done there with those systems.
Yeah.
What did you do then? You took a bunch of text that you'd already humanly labeled, and you told it, right, this is kind of abuse of vulnerability, and this is poor kind of living conditions and so on. And then you give that essentially to the program, and then you get it to try and work on other text that you've already manually identified, and then you're comparing the two. How did the software do versus how did the human
exactly. So sorry, I should have been more clear. So the entire data set of almost 1,000 news articles, we subdivided them without any overlaps according to training subset, validation subset, and test set. So what we fed during the training stage to the model is just the training subset. And as you said, it's essentially telling the model, here you go, this is the document, and this is the human assigned label. The model learns that kind of association. And once the model has learned that, or in other words, after the training phase, we apply the resulting model on the 20% subset. And how we're able to get this kind of metrics, performance metrics, is by comparing what is kind of the gold standard or the correct answers according to the test set, comparing that with the predictions of the model.
And just to clarify then, the assumption though therefore is that the human has done 100% accurate in terms of
so that's obviously a huge assumption, because here we do say that these are human kind of provided codes or annotations. There's a huge assumption there that this is really gold standard, that these are like the correct judgments, right? I mean, there's no guarantee there. What we usually do in NLP is we try to assess this agreement between multiple annotators, because obviously if they don't agree, then there's no chance that it's probably not correct at all. But if they agree to a satisfactory extent, then that's a good sign that okay, there's some consistency there. Yeah, Jaco.
Thanks, Riza. While you're on this slide, I was wondering what, if anything, you did to improve inter-annotator agreement, and is the gold standard not basically 100% intercoder agreement or approximating that?
Yeah, so Eric, just let me know if you want to come in, because I don't see you on my Zoom. But as far as I know, we didn't do anything to improve in NLP, and maybe that's not acceptable to many end users. Usually when we see an agreement of like 75% and above work, that makes us happy. But so we're like, okay, this is good. Let's see, let's proceed to the next step. But you're right. I think, obviously, if possible, to push it to the I don't know, closer to 100%, that would be better. Because essentially, you're right, this is the inter-annotator agreement kind of serves as the upper bound. So it's like saying that if your inter-annotator agreement or intercoder agreement is like this, then your system is probably, you want your system to achieve as high as that.
Sorry, we've opened the floodgates here. Sorry, or I have.
It's
sorry,
okay. There's another raised hand. I don't know if I mean, I'm happy to entertain the questions now, because Adebayo also has their hand raised.
Ade.
Yes, just a quick one. When you're trying to identify the sort of words or phrases that will form the basis of this your analysis, have you given thoughts to the fact that sometimes words spoken or written could mean different things in different contexts? Think of the fact that you are talking to people that are vulnerable, and you sometimes you wouldn't expect them to rely 100% on what they tell you to be the exact thing they mean.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
These things might lead you down a wrong assumption at the end of the day, because people that find themselves in these kind of circumstances, and also talking from the African context, words mean different things. Somebody will tell you something, and in actual reality, it meant something different. So did you give consideration to these kind of things?
I mean, that's a very good point. I don't think we can. I mean, I know what you're saying, that, you know, that obviously it can be taken out of context, and the challenge especially is there if working on news articles, because, like, for example, the one here I have on my screen, in a way it's like secondhand information, you see me? So you have the journalist kind of, I don't know, doing an interview and then interpreting it and then writing it up and so on. And as you correctly said, you know, things might have been lost in translation or kind of interpreted differently. So yeah, of course, a limitation here is that our approach, you know, whatever AI we're able to develop, will be informed by that kind of, you know, interpretation. The only thing that I can think of at the moment to try to look more closely into that is, as I mentioned in a previous slide, we do want to work on written narratives. And again, maybe this is not exactly the solution, but at least this is like first-hand information. So this is, as far as I know, for example, Contratados is, this is for Latin American countries. So this will be written in their native language, for example. So this will be like verbatim. Sorry, that's the word I'm looking for. Like verbatim narratives. So at least there's no kind of interpretation between, you know, the migrant worker and the kind of the journalist or the interviewer. So what we want to do later on is to compare. Because as you said correctly, you know, the language used will probably be different between kind of what you see in news articles and what you see in actual kind of migrant narratives.
Thank you.
Any other questions, or shall I try to complete and then?
It is a bit related. I know we're stopping you from getting onto the kind of the.
It's okay. I have only a couple of slides remaining.
No, that's fine. But I understand the punchline, and the purpose is essentially to say to what extent can the kind of human rationales add value and differentiate from the computer-based rationales. So my question, I understand, doesn't actually matter to that, because I understand that, you know, what you're seeking to do there doesn't necessarily rely on a particular kind of human coding. But I did just wonder, sort of more generally, for undertaking this kind of work, what you felt might be the role of domain experts. I just noticed in one of the example you gave was about women being prevented from getting promotion into higher posts, and you'd classified that as an indicator of forced labor and as abuse of vulnerability. Now, it could well be in that circumstance, but on the other hand, it could be sort of, well, it's contextual gender discrimination, and that isn't actually what's going on there. The difficulty of women to kind of push through the glass ceiling isn't necessarily actually what one would regard as forced labor. So obviously the way that one might get around that would be to bring in a domain expert who understands about forced labor, and they'd be able to then go through your categorizations and say, well, actually at the ILO, that sort of thing we regard as contextual discrimination. We wouldn't actually describe that ourselves as an abuse of vulnerability indicator of forced labor. And I'm sure there may be other examples as well. So just as a more general point, in these kind of exercises for analyzing and annotating, classifying text, do you tend to normally bring in a domain expert or not?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the answer is yes. We in any, that's why this kind of annotation, labeling, and codification exercises are really expensive because ideally you would want to bring in experts, and they're not cheap, right? You have to pay for their time and so on. You have to train them as well, because like the tool I showed is that one is not difficult to use, but of course you have to train them on the annotation guidelines and so on. There's a bit of overhead there, and in this particular piece of work with Eric, I can attest to Eric's efforts to try to bring in a lot of domain experts from the beginning of his PhD. Like, that's how we found those NGOs I mentioned in some of my slides, and actually sorry, that's the alarm. They're currently doing some work for Eric now to try to check the annotations or the labels assigned, because the annotators here, they are not experts, and they're kind of obviously basing on, I don't know, layman's knowledge, let's put it that way. But we do have partners from the NGOs who are checking what they've done as a further kind of level of annotator agreement. But also, I guess this is where I say we could use help from any expert. So for example, if there's anyone who's really an expert in this domain, because that's what we're struggling with at the moment. We're struggling to find people who are happy to spend time to sit down and do this kind of task, because it is kind of tedious, right? Reading all these documents and understanding them, and as you said, trying to interpret what's actually going on. That's one part. So definitely that's definitely crucial, I would say. But the other one is which I'm going to mention anyway. It's like on the explanation side of things, because I was also, if you remember, this work is not just about assigning the correct categories. It's also about enhancing the explainability, which means if you say this is this indicator or that indicator, we actually want to see why did you assign that, and this is in the form of explanation. So we also want to work with domain experts to make sure that these explanations that will be generated by our models or by Eric's approach later on, they actually make sense. So there are two ways on how we can assess the quality of these explanations. So we call them plausibility and faithfulness. So faithfulness is more about whether the explanation actually reflects the reasoning made by the model. But I think that is something that developers like ourselves would want to do, because we want to make sure that whatever went on during the training of the model is actually reflected in the explanation. But for end users and domain experts, I think what will be more important to them is the plausibility, meaning whether those explanations are actually convincing enough. And again, here at this stage of Eric's PhD, we want to come to domain experts to show them, okay, these are the explanations generated. Do they actually make sense to you? Do they actually convince you that this should be the correct prediction? So I guess it's really important to work with domain experts. And in NLP, so I did my PhD in biomedical text mining, and I remember every step of the way we really need domain experts to check everything we're doing. So we're trying to do the same here in this domain, except that it's a bit more tricky, because most of the people working in this domain are already doing things for free. like already doing kind of doing stuff out of their outside of their day job. So it's kind of asking them to do another thing on the side. So that's why it's a bit really difficult to engage with more domain experts. Let me just see. Eric, I don't know if you want to add anything to what I've been saying. Please feel free. Okay. Any other questions, or shall I just? I think I've shown most of my slides except for this one, really. Shall I just finish off with this?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So this is just to show the overall plan, because I have just scratched the surface, really, because as I said earlier, the results so far of those baseline models I showed in the table, those are based on almost off-the-shelf tools that Eric just played with. He still has 2 years, and those 2 years will be spent in developing other approaches, which will actually generate explanations. So here, what we mean by that, he has kind of these three different pathways, I should say. So if you recall, in our corpus, we have the labels and the rationales. So one way that we want to do is we use only the labels themselves. Eric will develop a method which will try to extract the rationales automatically, without having access to the human rationales, and then based on the automatically extracted rationales, to try to do the classification. So that's the first approach. But he wants to compare that with another approach, which is a model that jointly learns the extraction of the rationales and the assignment of the labels in one go. And again, maybe this is a bit opaque, but this is something interesting for computer scientists, because it's all about kind of comparing two different approaches to the same problem, where the second one is about what we call joint learning. And then the third one is where we actually make use as well of the human rationales in the data set to jointly learn the generation of the rationales and the assignment of the labels automatically. So again, this is all towards answering the question of what is the impact of using the human rationales in the training of the model. So this is why we kind of designed this framework, because we want to be able to assess exactly whether those human rationales, can be improved upon if we incorporate them during the learning process of the model. So yeah, I guess, yeah, I actually wanted to end with this slide again. I will just reiterate that, explanations, they're not useful if we're not able to work with end users to tell us if they actually mean anything, right? So this is why when we get to that point where we already have those generated rationales or explanations, we want to come to users, to end users and domain experts to actually ask them, are you convinced by this explanation? And I think this connects to your points earlier from your questions, right? So if you see a document and then the model automatically says it's this indicator because of some reason, and if you don't agree, then that probably means that this is not a convincing explanation, or the label is wrong. So this is the kind of this is the what we're trying to do here, is to strike a balance really between, again, the accuracy of the model or the performance of the model and being able to explain the predictions of that model. So, and then I put a list of references here in case you're interested in any of the kind of the references I cited in my slides earlier. And yeah, so I'd like to end with that, and thanks again for the opportunity to talk to your group.
Thanks, that's really super, Riza. Just before I open it up a little more generally, I wondered if you could reflect at all on what you think the ultimate prize or the objective might be here, that on the basis of the kinds of models and analysis that you're building, do you have any kind of sense yet of what the broader value of this might be, for example, in identifying forced labor or reducing modern slavery? That's
a very good question. Thankfully, Eric has talked about impact in his transfer report. So yeah, we have kind of thought about this a bit. So I mean, coming back to the numbers I was kind of mentioning at the beginning of my talk, it's prevalent and so on. So I think what would be really useful is if we come up with the model, which is on the one hand with satisfactory accuracy or performance, and on the other hand also able to explain explanations, and to apply such a model at a large scale. So for example, if we're able to apply such a model to, because right now we have 1,000 articles in our corpus, right? And that's over 2 years. But if we say that we're going to apply that to every news article, for example, that will be published in, I don't know, in The Guardian or in any news outlet, then that could kind of form the basis of, let's say, some sort of real-time monitoring. I want to say globally, but the truth is it's not easy, because that means having to take into account different languages, right? So I also mentioned that earlier, that obviously if we care about, let's say, Asia and the Pacific and Africa and so on, so then we can't just assume that this will all be in English, right? So that is one consideration. I think what I want to say is that when Eric gets his PhD, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of like, okay, how do we scale this up? How do we actually apply this in real time? How do we make sure that we are handling other types of languages, not just English? Because right now, admittedly, we're looking only at English. So, but that's kind of in a way, that's the dream. Let's put it that way.
Thanks. Yingchen.
Yes, thank you. That was a very insightful presentation. I learned a lot about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I also realized that, well, I have one question that Richard already asked. Another question that I have is the category of forced labor they presented earlier and the indicators kind of make me realize that, for example, if we talk about gig workers, you find that they fulfill a lot of those criteria.
Yeah.
And so the question is, well, it seems to me that the boundary is pretty unclear. And at the beginning, at the categorization, you have state-imposed forced labor, etc.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a category called self-imposed forced labor or some, because ironically, gig workers are recruited under the name of freedom.
Yeah.
So I find this quite interesting. You have state-imposed forced labor exploitation, and I guess it falls into forced labor exploitation. I'm not quite sure where it goes, but I think it would be interesting to have a category to take into account that kind of situation.
I think that's a very good insight. I mean, again, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong. So these are the numbers from the latest report I could find, which is, as I said, from 2017, and obviously a lot has changed in the world since then. So it might be the case that, gig economy, they might have their own category by now. But I think you're right. I think if we really have to fit it in, it might be under forced labor exploitation, only because of the fact that this is private sector. But as you said, gig workers are probably kind of part, in a way, it's a bit of self-imposed, or maybe because of the lack of awareness of what they're entitled to, or something like that. Yeah.
Well, no, from our perspective of social scientists, certainly it is not, I was being ironic to say self-imposed. Clearly, it's all sorts of structural reasons, structural factors that give rise to their vulnerable position. Which,
it's probably private. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still private, right? It's still kind of.
The truth is that there are no better for them. That comes out to be the better option out of other job opportunities that they have access to. So these kind of structural conditions are quite important. I don't know. Probably it won't be reflected in a computing model. In any case, I find this research really interesting, and I'm also thinking that perhaps a similar process could be applied to other domains such as refugees or other kind of vulnerable situations. Except I don't know whether there are like clear sets of indicators to research them.
I think that's very relevant, especially if we're looking kind of under the broader umbrella of modern slavery. And I think at the very beginning of Eric's project, we were thinking, shall we do modern slavery kind of more generally? And I think one of the reasons we eventually focus on forced labor is exactly because of kind of a well-defined typology. But yeah, I mean, definitely in terms of the methodology or the approach being applied, if let's just say there is a predefined kind of typology that applies to refugees and so on, then it in principle it can be applied to that, although it means probably having to annotate or to label some data in that particular topic.
Also, in terms of sources of information, I wonder when the algorithm is mature, perhaps it could be applied to broader sets of documents or information such as the social media, because
Yeah,
I mean, you can't just rely on journalists and NGOs reporting on these situations, right? I would imagine that it's very important to listen to the people who actually are in those situations and who try to send their voice out, right?
Yeah.
How can the algorithms be applied to those different
so that's
sources?
Actually, that's a very good question, because in NLP, we kind of make a distinction between NLP for, let's say, how do I say this, like cleaner text, like standard language. So for example, like the type of language you see in news articles or reports, versus the NLP for social media content, because as you know, the language in social media, it's kind of, more noisy, more challenging to work with. You have to clean it up a lot, and so on. And also social media, there's a lot of misinformation and so on. So that's a completely different domain, as you said. But again, the approach, like when I was talking about text classification, that also applies to that, to those kind of documents. It's just that they're much shorter documents, and needs a lot of pre-processing. But yeah, you're right. The challenge as well is, again, I mentioned it briefly already, like misinformation, but also whether those workers would actually post something publicly in social media, is if they're really feeling threatened, or so they probably won't publicize the post,
which they could be in their own groups.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's more like it's there's also that kind of data privacy and kind of ethical issues. You have to jump through those hoops, because we were told that by the 58, the NGO we were working with, that they do work with migrant workers, but they have their own kind of private Facebook group, for example, and once you try to get data from those, it becomes a bit more difficult, really.
Thank you.
It would be interesting, just following on from Eugene's point, it would be interesting if, for example, you get yourself to a point where you're satisfied with a system that is good at identifying the 11 indicators within a corpus of text, to then apply that to an equivalent corpus of text about gig work, and to see what it came up with. And you could understand that as a very interesting article that would, a paper, sorry, that would presumably identify a series of forced labor indicators in descriptions of gig work in various locations around the world. And you can also imagine, for instance, doing a comparative study of a corpus of text around gig work in the global north, around a corpus of text of gig work in the global south, or comparing digital gig work of cloud work versus geographically tethered physical gig work, for example, something, those kinds of things. So I think actually as an analytical tool, there's some very interesting things that you could do with it in relation to gig work, and no doubt one could also think of other forms of labor that are not necessarily labeled as forced labor, but which you might apply it to, and also use that as an analytical device there to understand the extent to which these forms of labor reflect indicators of forced labor. So I think there's something very interesting there that could come out of that. Any other questions from others who are attending? I wanted to, Ade, go ahead.
Yes, I think it might also be helpful to consider the perpetrator's view of things too, because we are looking at those that are at the receiving end of this forced labor. Those are the victims. Perhaps if you look at the perpetrator side of things, you might look at what are the drivers of these things. And then maybe that way you could come up with some kind of robust and holistic kind of solution that you could use to deter these sort of things happening going into the future. Because at best, I think what we could really do with what you're doing at the moment, it's because these things, this information you're getting, they are as a result of people's lived experiences. So they are only telling you what has happened to them.
Yeah.
Whatever you get from this might not necessarily be used to deter the perpetrators. The victims' viewpoints you are getting from what you're doing at the moment. So perhaps if you explore the perpetrator's point of view. At least we might think that it is mainly financially motivated.
Yeah.
Than that. So if you explore that a bit more, then you could come up with perhaps some kind of holistic solution going forward with this.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think one of our partners, 58, they have interest in that as well, like looking from the perspective of the companies from the private sector. So yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, maybe not for Eric's PhD itself, but yeah, again, one of those follow-on kind of research questions that would definitely be worth it. Yeah,
you could see how this would fit into a much larger research project, couldn't you? About about modern slavery as one component of that, along with other things that would deal with the structural drivers and constraints and so forth.